Good morning. My name is Rick Broderick, and I want to thank TLPI and the folks at Justice for inviting me to come today. As Kelly said, I was a member of the Attorney General's Task Force or Advisory Committee on American Indian Alaska Native Children Exposed to Violence, and what I'd like to do today is first of all ask you, how many people have heard of this report? You all need to read it, and I'll tell you why. The report was presented to the Attorney General about 2 years ago, and I'll speak just real briefly about the task force or the advisory committee itself and the circumstances around its coming together. The Attorney General charging us, and then I want to spend a little bit more time talking about what's happened in that 2-year period. And then I was going to talk about the way forward, but Deborah did such a much better job than I will briefly, sort of in my own words, restate what she said. Thank you, Deborah. Okay. In 2013, Attorney General Eric Holder convened the Attorney General's Task Force advisory. I don't know why I always say task force. Why do I do that, Jerry? Anyway, it's an advisory committee on American Indian Alaska Native children exposed to violence. There were 11 advisory committee members, and this advisory committee sort of followed 2 other groups that I'll mention in just a minute. We held 4 public hearings, and I should say at this point that TLPI, the folks who put on this conference were the folks who helped us, and I would be remiss if I didn't thank Jerry and his staff for the wonderful support that we got and help in generating the report. In any case, we had, as I said, 4 public hearings in Bismarck, North Dakota, Phoenix, Arizona, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and Anchorage, Alaska, and in association with these, we also had a number of listening sessions in a number of communities that were associated with these hearings. There were about 575 people who attended the 4 hearings. About 150 witnesses testified, and we got thousands and thousands of pages of written testimony. So the communities and Indian people in general responded in a great way to the call for testimony, and all the report really does is puts onto paper the stories that we heard, and the recommendations weren't ours. We just restated the recommendations that we heard over and over and over again. So as I said, the report was presented to the Attorney General on the 18th of November in 2014. And it contained 5 chapters, and they're here. I won't read them to you, but it also included 54 recommendations, many of which address and are recommendations to the Congress and to executive branch agencies outside the Department of Justice. I know the Attorney General, he was very direct and very clear that he wanted a high-level report that would recommend a course forward that would accomplish what needed to be done. And we didn't think that the Department of Justice could accomplish what needed to be done alone. In fact, we knew they could not. And so the recommendations address the entire government, and I know that is causing some difficulty perhaps for the Department of Justice because they can't implement it all, but that's okay. It I think represents what we heard and who we feel within the government has a role to play and a responsibility to assist. The core principles in the report that was adopted by the committee are these: empowering tribes, removing barriers, and providing resources. The other two reports that I would mention that preceded this, one Troy was the chairman of, the ILOC committee. The other one was the Justice Department's Committee on Kids Exposed to Violence in the Nation. And they both made recommendations that we drew upon heavily. In fact, we endorsed them and repeated them verbatim in our report. They were that good. And in fact, when I read the report, the ILOC report, I didn't think we had much to do. I thought that they had said much that needed to be said very well. But in fact, these three reports are extremely valuable to all of us. Here's the website that you can, if you don't have the report, that you can find it at. It's a really long URL. I will tell you that all you have to do, the way I found it, because the active website from OJJDP is no longer active, just Google the report, and this is the website that comes up. I checked it yesterday. I know it works. And if you don't have a copy of the report, you can get it in its entirety there. So, we'll fast forward 2 years since the report was published, and I'd like to talk about some progress that has been made since then. There's a lot of things that are sort of in progress that involve this agency meeting with that agency. I'm not going to talk about that stuff. I'll leave that to the federal folks who do that. But there are some fairly significant accomplishments that I want to touch on. The first bright spot is first, the really first bright spot doesn't have to do with any of the stuff that happened over the last 2 years. The fact that these three reports exist are a hugely big deal. I mean, yeah, they're reports on paper, and here's a copy of one of them, and you can get them online. But the fact that there is a record that documents the terrible things that happen to kids, and present a path forward in a series of recommendations and names the folks who should do it is really important. And it'll be important not only now, but in the future as new leadership comes to DC. So that's the first thing I would mention. The second happened in 2015, and it was the repeal of Section 910 of Title IX of the Violence Against Women's Act. And what that did was there was a provision in VAWA 13 that precluded Alaska from participating, and it was literally a crime. And so our report was not the only place that this was mentioned, but I'm happy to report that in 2015 those provisions were repealed, and so Alaska is no longer excluded from this title in VAWA. The second one is very timely. One of the things that we heard about at some length during the hearings were the ICWA, and one of the things that folks recommended were that the BIA was in the process of reconsidering the guidelines in ICWA, and people were quite clear that guidelines weren't enough, that the BIA need to issue recommendations. And I will tell you that Monday these recommendations take effect. There was a long process to develop them, a long public comment period. They were passed, or they were published in June of this year. And on Monday, the 12th of December, these ICWA regulations take effect. So that is a significant accomplishment. Another thing that we heard a lot about was the difficulty that tribes have in interfacing with the states, the various states, around a multitude of issues that deal with kids. I want to compliment the Justice Department, OJJDP and Jerry, and Office of Victims of Crime, everybody who had anything to do with it. Somehow, on Wednesday, there was a breakout session A10, which brought folks from the victims of crime at the state level with the tribal victim services folks, and they talked, and it was a fairly positive conversation. So that's one example of what needs to continue to happen to bring states and tribes together in a way that allows them to address the issues that confront them all. And this is one that will take much time. It will take continued effort, and on a state-by-state, by tribe basis to continue. But it was an example that I was very happy to see that happened this week. The Department of Justice has issued a couple of grants that I've mentioned. D. Bigfoot was here earlier in 2015. There was a trauma-informed care grant, a technical assistance grant issued to the University of Oklahoma. Dee was a member of the advisory committee, and she also is the director at the University of Oklahoma of the program that administers this grant. So there's technical assistance widely available now to tribes to incorporate trauma-informed care into their programming. The other one I would mention is supporting trauma-informed juvenile justice systems for tribes in 2016, was issued by the OJJDP. It was awarded to 4 tribes, to the Winnebago Tribe of Nebraska, Southern Ute Tribe, Northern Arapaho Tribe, and the White Earth Band of Chippewa. And it provides them funds to essentially overhaul their juvenile justice programming to focus on trauma-informed care. A lot of what we heard in the task force or in the advisory committee's hearings was a need for trauma-informed services. The exposure to trauma among American Indian Alaska Native children is nearly universal, and so to not use these techniques and this science to help these kids is something that we all need to avoid. We need to be doing trauma-informed care. And so both Dee and Marilyn Zimmerman, who was at OJJDP for a time and has since returned to the University of Montana, which is doing the technical assistance for that grant, were both trauma-informed care experts who continue to do that work in Indian country. Two others I'd mention just quickly. The 7% set aside for tribal funding at OJP has been in the president's budget for a time, for some years actually, and it has never succeeded in surviving the congressional approval process. It is again in 2017. The government is operating under a continuing resolution. I assume it still is. It was as of Friday. And so whether that provision survives or not is yet to be determined when the Congress passes the budget, but it's something the administration has put forward to consolidate funds at the Department of Justice to address the needs of tribes. The last one I would mention is a training program. One of the recommendations that the advisory committee had was to make sure that all federal employees who deal with issues related to American Indians and Alaska Natives were trained to understand, to help them understand what they were supposed to do. And working effectively with tribal governments has been in place at the Office of Personnel Management for about 8 years, and I'm happy to report that DOJ has taken the lead in updating that training. Leslie Hagan, who was here earlier this week, and Gina Tyner-Dawson have both played a role in seeing that training updated. And it becomes a very opportune thing as a new administration comes to DC to help those people who will come to work who may not have experience dealing with Indian people and the issues that they confront them to actually receive some training to help them do that. It ought to be required, and I would urge federal agencies to to make that training mandatory. It's a very good training. It doesn't, people might actually learn something. So I hope that will occur. Okay, what I want to close with is where do we go from here? And as I said, Deborah said this much better than I, but I put 3 words on the screen that sort of capture it for me. First of all, we all need to be educated. We need to educate ourselves, and we need to educate others. And these 3 reports provide a good way to do that. So if you haven't read all 3 of them, I really urge you to do that. They'll provide an understanding of what occurred in those three groups and a path forward. The second thing that we need to do in pursuing a way forward is advocacy. As I said, I can't say it as well as Deborah, but we all are advocates. We need to continue to be advocates, and we need and irrespective of what party is in the White House, the Congress, wherever, that shouldn't be a reason to abandon advocacy. And I know none of you would ever do that, but don't avoid the opportunity to advocate to those who you have not had the opportunity to talk to before. Irrespective of the new administration's position on the issues that are contained in these 3 reports, they need to be educated. And please take every opportunity, no matter who you can talk to, whether they want to listen or not, to educate and advocate on behalf of kids. And the last thing is implementation. As I said, I can't predict what the position of the new administration will be on these issues. There may be efforts within the executive branch of the Congress to implement some of the objectives, all of the objectives, none of the recommendations. But you have an opportunity to pursue implementation locally. Please use these reports in your programming, to support your programming, to enhance your programming. You can use them as justification for grants that you may apply for, but you can also use them for the development of public policy locally, and you can use them for justification for the resource allocation process locally. I think they're there to help you, and I really encourage you to see this as a positive opportunity to use them, to learn about them, to advocate on behalf of kids, and use them in the process, and also to implement wherever you have the chance, whether it be locally, at the state level, or at the federal level. Thank you very much.